The rain had been falling for so long that men stopped calling it weather. It was simply the air they lived in, the sound that tied one day to the next. The hills were soaked in a gray that never dried, and the mud held on to every footprint as if trying to remember who passed through. On a morning like any other, Sergeant Ethan Cole raised his hand, and the patrol stopped. Somewhere beyond the ridge a gun coughed once, then went silent again, and the only thing left was the whisper of rain sliding off their helmets. He had learned to listen the way a hunted animal listens, not for a sound itself, but for the absence that comes just before it. The ridge curved downward into a narrow saddle where fog thickened until it looked solid. Ethan motioned for the men to spread out. They obeyed without speaking. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said too many times. The youngest, David, carried his rifle like an apology. The others carried theirs like a habit that refused to die. Somewhere to their right a small stream ran down from the rocks, its voice lost in the endless hiss of water meeting water. Ethan's boots sank into clay. A branch lay across the trail. Too straight, too clean in a world that had forgotten straight lines. He crouched, ran a glove along the wet ground, and felt the pulse of something waiting underneath. The earth was patient. Men were not. When the third man stepped forward, the world erupted. Light swallowed color. Heat replaced thought. Ethan felt himself thrown sideways into a body that could not keep its shape. For a moment, there was no sky, no sound, only the blinding certainty that this was how everything ended. When hearing returned, it came like a wound reopening. Voices tried to name what was missing. Abram was shouting for his legs, though his voice came from the wrong place. Another man whispered, "Mother," as if the word might rebuild him. Ethan forced air into lungs that had forgotten how. He pressed his hands into mud, found purchase, stood, and saw what remained. The fog had torn itself apart, revealing a patch of ground that looked chewed rather than broken. The smell of iron coated his teeth. Rain filled the craters as quickly as they appeared, turning horror into landscape. They did what soldiers do. Tourniquets, morphine, radio calls that sounded too calm for what they carried. When the helicopter came, it churned the fog into obedience. The wind from its blades bent the grass flat, exposing the indifferent clay beneath. Bodies rose toward the sky on stretchers, wrapped so tightly that the rain could no longer touch them. When the noise faded, the world closed again. Ethan had 6 men left and a piece of trail that now had his name carved into it. The walk back to the base was slow, every step a negotiation between memory and gravity. The rain eased only to test whether they noticed they did. At the wire perimeter, the guard waved them through without looking. Recognition had become an unnecessary luxury. Inside the compound, canvas walls sagged under water weight, and the air smelled of fuel, metal, and the tired hope of dry socks. Ethan turned in the report because reports were what kept a man from disappearing entirely. He listed coordinates, casualties, causes. His handwriting was steady, though he could not remember moving his hand. After the debrief, he lingered beside the map. Red lines crossed the hills like scars drawn by someone who didn't care to heal. He traced their route with a finger, stopping where the explosion had rewritten everything. It was less than 2 inches on paper. He stared until the ink blurred and the paper looked like a wet sky. He wondered how far a person could travel without leaving the same circle behind. Night gathered with the quiet authority of something that had done it 1,000 times before. Ethan lay on his cot and listened to rain on canvas, each drop a small hammer tapping the story deeper into his skull. Sleep came in fragments, sharp-edged and damp. In the dark, he saw flashes. The branch, Abram's face, the color that wasn't color at all. He woke before dawn and stared at the roof until it stopped being a roof and became just another horizon he couldn't reach. By morning, the base was already moving. Trucks growled awake. Generators argued with themselves. Men emerged from tents like ideas the night had almost forgotten. Ethan washed his face in a metal basin, the water brown from rust and sky. The mirror above it was a bent piece of tin that returned only a suggestion of who he was. He shaved without caring about blood. It was all the same color in this light. Somewhere near the airstrip, a transport's engine coughed, and a line of new arrivals began to form. The convoy came through the gate an hour later. Supply crates, medical kits, a handful of faces too clean for this place. Among them was a woman in a medic's coat, her steps deliberate against the mud. Clara Cole had always moved like that, as if she believed the ground was watching and she didn't want to disappoint it. She spotted him before he saw her. For a second, she seemed unsure whether the outline she recognized could still be real. Then she smiled, a quiet curve of certainty in a world that had lost shape. They met beside a stack of fuel drums. Neither spoke. The silence between them was not awkward. It was sacred, like the pause between a heartbeat and the next. She reached out, touched his arm lightly, as if confirming temperature rather than existence. He looked at her and saw both memory and accusation. She smelled faintly of antiseptic and the world before the rain. Around them the base kept moving, boots on mud, shouted orders, the drone of engines. The war did not pause to notice reunion. Clara was assigned to the field hospital, a row of tents where light was rationed and hope treated like contraband. She worked quickly, efficiently, her hands knowing where to press, where to release. Ethan visited once, under the pretext of checking security. He watched her bend over a wounded man, speaking softly as she tied a bandage. She looked up and caught him watching. For a heartbeat, they were husband and wife again, not soldier and nurse. Then, someone called for more gauze and the moment folded itself away. That night, he waited for her outside the mess hall. They shared coffee that tasted of smoke and metal. She asked about his men. He said as little as possible. Words felt like mines, safe until you stepped on the wrong one. She told him she had volunteered for this deployment because distance had become unbearable. He nodded, though part of him wished she hadn't. Love was a fragile thing to bring into a place that broke even steel. For a few days they existed inside a small pocket of stolen peace. The world beyond the wire continued its grim arithmetic, but inside their tent they found minutes that didn't belong to the war. He told her about the river near his hometown, how it turned silver in the evenings. She spoke of a park bench where she used to read, the one near the bakery that sold terrible bread but perfect mornings. They built a house of words and lived there until duty remembered their names. Colonel Harlan Reeves arrived the following week. The camp tightened its posture, the way men do when someone important enters a room. Reeves was the kind of officer whose voice could make rules sound like favors. His uniform was immaculate, his smile measured to the millimeter. During his inspection of the hospital, he thanked every nurse by name, though he had met them only once. When he reached Clara, his tone softened almost imperceptibly. He held her gaze a moment longer than protocol required, then moved on. Ethan noticed, and in the space that opened between that noticing and his next breath, something cold settled in. Reeves visited often after that, sometimes to discuss logistics, sometimes under the excuse of morale. Clara answered his questions politely, her face neutral, her body angled toward the patients. Ethan told himself it was harmless, that the man was only lonely in the way powerful men are. Yet each evening he found new ways to be at the opposite end of the base when Reeves was near. Fear wears many uniforms, and Ethan had started to recognize all of them. The colonel called him in for a briefing one morning. The tent smelled of coffee and paper, the air too warm. A map spread across the table, its lines redrawn since yesterday. Reeves spoke of strategic value, of rotation schedules, of minimizing unnecessary losses. His words were careful, his tone almost kind. Then he mentioned that someone with Ethan's experience might serve better in a leadership post away from direct combat. It would be safer, he said, and safer meant smarter. The offer hung between them like a rope, lifeline or snare, hard to tell. Ethan said he would think about it. Reeves smiled, as though he already knew the answer time would give. When Ethan stepped outside, the rain had stopped, and for a second the world looked ordinary. He found Clara near the ward, sorting supplies. She glanced up and saw the storm still behind his eyes. "You look tired," she said. "Everyone looks tired," he answered. It was true, and not true at once. That night he couldn't sleep. The wind had changed direction. It pushed at the tent as if testing its resolve. He lay there imagining a version of himself who had not hesitated on the ridge, who had not lost 3 men to the earth's hunger. That version never existed, but the idea was enough to keep him awake until the first gray light seeped in. By then he had almost convinced himself that survival was a kind of courage. Morning found him at the perimeter, staring toward the hills. The fog was back, softer now, like a memory trying to forgive itself. Behind him the camp stirred, the day repeating its litany: boots, rifles, coffee, rain. He touched the lighter in his pocket, the one Clara had given him years ago, its initials carved shallowly into brass. It still worked, though the flame trembled against the wind. He closed the lid and let the sound mark the end of something he couldn't name. Days blurred together after that. Rain reclaimed its authority and turned the compound into a living swamp. Men moved slower, their laughter shorter. The war seemed to have settled into their bones. Ethan kept his distance from Clara, not by choice, but by exhaustion. Words had become too expensive. He worked logistics, filled out forms, and listened to the hollow tone of his own reports. Every sound inside the tent was the same sound as the one outside, a world eroding by degrees. Clara noticed the change but said nothing. She had seen too many men lose themselves quietly. The body survived. The soul took a leave of absence. During late shifts, she sat beside the wounded, reading letters aloud that smelled of home and time that no longer existed. When she paused, she could hear her heartbeat, slow and heavy, as if measuring something she could not yet name. She thought of Ethan sitting somewhere beyond the lamplight, and wondered if war made people honest or just stripped away the polite lies. Colonel Reeves began to visit the hospital more frequently. He brought small comforts, fresh fruit, cigarettes, a bottle of wine hidden in a medical crate. His presence filled the tent with a warmth that didn't belong. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel seen, but also owned Clara, thanked him each time, out of duty, never out of need. Reeves's compliments landed gently, but left a bruise when they faded. "You remind me," he once said, "that not everything here has to rot." She didn't reply. The words were already rotting. When Ethan heard about these visits, he felt nothing at first, then too much all at once. He told himself he trusted her. He told himself Reeves was a man who required attention the way some men required air, yet he began to notice the subtle shifts. How Reeves's name hung longer in conversations, how Clara seemed to fold into herself when it was mentioned. The silence between husband and wife grew longer, stretched thin by unspoken things. At night, when he turned to her side of the bed, all he found was the cold crease of fabric. A week later, Reeves summoned him again. The colonel's tone was friendly, almost fatherly. He spoke of opportunity, of relief from the front line, of how command needed men like Ethan to maintain order behind the wire. The offer carried the weight of something more than professional. Reeves poured 2 glasses of whiskey, but only one man drank. "It's your choice," he said, "but choices have shadows." Ethan understood perfectly. The words meant stay alive or keep dying slowly. When he left the tent, he could feel the decision walking just behind him, whispering, keeping pace. That evening, Clara asked him about the meeting. He said it was routine. She didn't believe him, but let it go. Instead, she told him that the hospital was running low on morphine and that the next convoy might not make it through. He nodded without hearing. The rain hit the canvas with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost mocking. She reached for his hand, but he drew away, pretending to adjust his sleeve. She watched him a long moment and said, "I miss you." He answered, "I'm right here." The lie sounded harmless until it wasn't. The following night, the base held a celebration, a crude attempt at morale. Music leaked from old speakers. Bottles appeared like contraband blessings. Someone convinced Clara to join, arguing that the wounded would sleep better without her fussing over them. She agreed, though her heart wasn't in it. Ethan stood by the door, cigarette trembling between his fingers. Reeves was already there, laughing with a group of officers. When he saw Clara, he made space beside him. She hesitated, then accepted. The room shifted its attention the way firelight moves towards something flammable. Ethan watched from a corner. The whiskey burned without warmth. He saw Reeves pour her a drink, saw her laugh politely, saw her hand brushed aside as though she were being guided, not touched. Every instinct told him to move, to intervene, to claim the fragment of dignity still within reach. But the same fear that had frozen him on the ridge, the same voice that had whispered to him during the offer of promotion, returned now, quiet and reasonable. "Don't make a scene. Don't draw fire. Survive." Hours later the music slowed. Clara stepped outside for air, her steps uncertain. Reeves followed. Ethan stayed where he was. A man near him joked about officers and their games. Ethan smiled without knowing why. He finished his drink, walked out into the rain, and did not look toward the shadows where voices blurred. The world was already writing that night without his help. What happened after belonged to no report. Clara came back to the ward pale and expressionless. She scrubbed her hands until the water ran clear, then kept scrubbing. Reeves avoided her eyes the next morning, but sent for Ethan with congratulations. The promotion was official. Command needed officers of composure, he said, men who understood the cost of restraint. Ethan signed the papers with a steady hand and a heart that felt borrowed. Days folded into each other again. Clara worked as if her body were made of task lists. Reeves left for another sector. Ethan transferred to administrative command, far from the hospital tents. They passed each other in corridors without words. One evening she stopped him outside the supply depot. Her face was tired, her voice calm. "I'm leaving," she said. "Rotation orders." He nodded. She waited for something, apology, anger, anything, but received only silence. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. He said, "You too." That was the last time they spoke. The trucks departed before dawn. Rain followed them like a curtain closing. Ethan watched until the last set of tail lights disappeared into fog. He stood there long enough for his boots to sink into the mud. When he finally turned back toward the camp, he realized he had forgotten how to pray. The years after the war were quieter, but not gentler. Ethan wore his new rank the way one wears an old injury, something that aches in good weather. He learned to speak in ceremonies, to tell rooms full of uniforms about valor and sacrifice. The audience applauded the idea of him, not the man himself. At night he removed his medals, placed them on the desk beside the lighter, and wondered if courage had simply changed its definition. Clara, far from the front, tried to rebuild herself in a world that preferred not to hear her story. The child she carried became her only argument with despair. She named him David, a name simple enough to survive any language. He grew strong, curious, kind, everything she had hoped Ethan might remember being. She never told him the full truth. Some inheritances are too heavy for children. Years passed, and David joined the military, believing he was continuing his father's example, unaware he was walking toward him. When he was assigned as aide to General Cole, neither recognized the other. Yet in the weeks that followed, something familiar began to grow between them, a quiet understanding that required no words. Ethan saw in the young man's gestures a mirror of himself before the rain. David admired the old soldier's discipline, his calm, his silence. They became the kind of friends men are allowed to be when the world has run out of better terms. And then, as all stories do, the past found its way back. A letter arrived from a hospital for veteran nurses. Clara was dying. Ethan read the words slowly, tracing them with a finger as if they might vanish. He visited her that evening. She was smaller, almost translucent, but her eyes were still sharp. They spoke softly about ordinary things, the weather, the food, the kindness of strangers. Before he left, she pressed his hand and said, "He's a good boy." He didn't ask which boy. He already knew. When she passed, David received another letter, her final one. It told the truth with a gentleness that made cruelty irrelevant. She wrote of love that had failed and endured, of fear that had stolen more than war ever could. She ended with a plea, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. David sought out the general the next morning. He didn't speak. He simply handed him the letter. Ethan read it once, then again. And when he looked up, his eyes were full of a storm that had finally learned to rain. They walked together outside the building. No ranks, no words. The world around them was quiet in a way that felt earned. Ethan took the lighter from his pocket and placed it in David's hand. "Keep it," he said. "It's seen enough of the dark." David closed his fingers around it. The metal was warm from another man's life. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight lift, not absolution, not peace, just the small mercy of being seen and not despised. Rain began again, gentle, almost kind. They stood under it, two silhouettes breathing the same damp air. Somewhere behind them, the years rearranged themselves, quieter now, as if finally satisfied, and for a brief, impossible moment, courage found its voice again. The war retreated without ending. It simply folded itself into another shape, quieter but just as cruel. Ethan Cole wore his new rank with a stiffness that never softened. His name appeared on documents that moved men, supplies, decisions, lines of ink that looked like control but felt like exile. He was no longer at the front, yet the front had followed him. It lived in his sleep, in the tremor that crossed his hand when someone said, "Explosion!" In the moments of silence that filled entire rooms, people saluted him now. That was the curse of survival. Respect came only when there was nothing left worth respecting. He spent his days inside a prefab office where the walls sweated and the maps never told the truth. Outside, the world remained soaked, a landscape that refused to dry. Reeves visited often, discussing reports in a tone that sounded like generosity. The colonel spoke of responsibility, of how certain burdens belonged only to the strong. He smiled as if every sentence were a mirror showing Ethan a better man. Ethan listened, nodded, and learned the art of appearing intact. At night, he avoided his quarters. The cot, the uniform folded at its foot, the empty space beside it, all of it whispered too loudly. He would walk the perimeter instead, smoking until the fog erased him from his own outline. Sometimes he imagined Clara reading somewhere far away, her lips moving softly over words meant for someone else. The thought hurt, but it was a clean hurt, one that didn't leave stains. Letters arrived from the rear lines, the kind printed by typewriters and sealed with tired hope. Most carried numbers, supply totals, requests for medical shipments, but one envelope bore handwriting he knew too well. The sight of it froze him. He didn't open it right away. He carried it in his pocket for 3 days, like a relic or a curse. When he finally tore it open, the first words were simple. "I am safe. Then, I think of you every time it rains." The rest was less a letter than a heartbeat caught on paper. She wrote about the patients, about the sea she could almost hear from the hospital grounds, about sleep that came in small, untrustworthy doses. She didn't mention Reeves, didn't mention the night. She didn't have to. Silence has its own grammar, and he read it perfectly. He tried to write back, but every sentence collapsed under its own honesty. What could he say? "I failed you but kept breathing. I traded love for promotion. I remember the color of your fear." He burned 3 drafts before sending a single line. "The days are long. I hope the nights are kind." It wasn't enough, but it was all that survived the translation from guilt to ink. Months slipped by. Reeves was promoted again, his influence widening like oil on water. He spoke to Ethan about unity, about loyalty, about how men like them carried the weight others couldn't. "The war rewards clarity," Reeves said. "You can't afford doubt. Doubt is a luxury for those who've already paid their debt." Ethan wondered what debt he was paying, and to whom the colonel didn't need to explain. Power is its own confession. Rumors began to ripple through the ranks, whispers of deals made, of shipments redirected, of orders rewritten before they reached the field. Ethan pretended not to hear. He'd learned that the price of silence was acceptance, and the price of speaking was extinction. He filled his days with routine forms, numbers, signatures, each one a small denial that kept the larger one at bay. Meanwhile, in the hospital by the sea, Clara's world narrowed to the rhythm of breathing, hers and the lives around her. The war had moved inland, but its echo still rattled the windows. She carried new weight now, hidden beneath her uniform. At first it was only exhaustion, then a slow understanding that something within her was refusing to die. When she told the head nurse, the woman looked at her with quiet calculation. "You'll be transferred," she said. "You can't stay here." Clara didn't argue. She was too tired to fight the logic of survival. Nights were the hardest. The body changes before the heart is ready. She lay awake listening to the sea and the wind arguing about distance. She thought of Ethan and the last words they had shared. Simple, ordinary, unfinished. She tried to hate him, but hate required energy, and she had none left. Instead, she felt something heavier. Pity, not for him, but for the part of herself that had believed love could survive a war intact. Weeks turned into months. Her belly grew, and with it the necessity of secrecy. The administration processed her transfer quietly. The hospital had learned to hide its contradictions. She packed her few belongings, a photograph, a notebook, the lighter she had once given him. She lit it once, just to see if it still worked. The flame rose steady and small, like a truth too fragile to share. Back at the forward base, Ethan's promotion carried him into meetings with men who spoke in abstractions. They discussed casualties as if they were columns in a ledger. He took notes, nodded, and left the room each time with a piece of himself missing. Reeves praised him publicly, called him indispensable, a soldier's soldier. In private, the colonel's tone shifted. "You understand what keeps men obedient," he said one evening. "Fear and hope. One hand washes the other." Ethan knew which hand he represented. Sometimes, when the power generators failed and the camp fell into darkness, he imagined walking out past the wire, into the rain, and never stopping. He imagined finding the ridge where the explosion had opened the earth and asking it to finish what it started. But he always turned back. Habit, more than courage, kept him alive. Clara's transfer took her inland to a sanatorium surrounded by fields of grass that bent with the wind like slow water. There were no sirens here, no mortars, no uniformed men giving orders. The silence should have been peaceful, but peace is a sound the heart must relearn. She walked the corridors during daylight, touching the walls as if confirming their solidity. At night she wrote in her notebook, "He survived. I survived. I don't know what that means anymore." The nurses were kind in the way people are when they expect nothing in return. One of them found her one morning standing by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. "You should rest," the nurse said. Clara smiled faintly. "I am resting," she replied, though her eyes were wide open. The child moved for the first time a week later. She felt it like a whisper from underwater, life asserting itself without permission. She pressed her hand against her stomach and thought of Ethan again, of the man he had been before the mud, before the fear. For a moment she let herself believe that some part of him still existed, somewhere beyond the map, uncorrupted. Reeves, far from the sea, began consolidating his power. Reports reached Ethan of supply shortages, of soldiers lacking medicine that never arrived. When he raised the issue, Reeves waved it away. "Command delays," he said. "Paperwork moves slower than bullets." Ethan didn't argue. He had learned that truth, once compromised, can't walk upright again. But one evening, after too much whiskey, he found himself writing another letter, this one unsent. I think I gave away more than I meant to. I think the war keeps receipts. The next morning he tore it to pieces and fed it to the stove. Months later, a convoy from the rear brought news of reduced casualties and rumors of an approaching armistice. The men dared to laugh again, thin, brittle laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at the map that had lied to him for years. He thought of Clara's letter, of the words, "Every time it rains," and realized it had been raining since the day they met. He didn't know whether to find comfort or punishment in that. At the sanatorium, Clara went into labor during a storm. The doctor arrived too late. The nurse did most of the work. The child was born small but strong, his cry sharp enough to cut through thunder. She named him David, after a dream she couldn't quite remember. When they placed him in her arms, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: clarity. This was what remained when everything else had been taken. This was proof that the world hadn't finished with her yet. When morning came, the storm was gone. Sunlight fell across the sheets like a foreign language she'd forgotten how to speak. She whispered the name again, testing its weight. David. The syllables fit her mouth perfectly, as if they had always been waiting there. Back at the front, Reeves declared the war effectively over. "It will take months to sign," he told the officers, "but for us, it's done." Ethan nodded, but the words landed wrong. Wars don't end, they only change addresses. He looked out the tent flap toward the gray horizon. Somewhere far away, a child had just drawn his first breath, and the rain was finally resting. Peace, when it finally arrived, felt counterfeit. The ceasefire was signed on paper, thick enough to disguise the tremor of the hand that signed it. Command celebrated, men packed, journalists wrote about victory. But in the camps, the air was too heavy to believe it. Guns were lowered, not because hearts had changed, but because fatigue had become a kind of faith. Ethan Cole stood on the runway as transport planes groaned skyward, carrying away the last echoes of a war that refused to die neatly. He had orders to remain. Promotion again, though the word now sounded like punishment. Reeves was already in the capital, wrapped in medals and speeches. He sent a single telegram. "Well done, old friend. We survived." Ethan read it twice and left it on his desk. Survival, he thought, was just another name for guilt stretched thin over years. The base dissolved one department at a time. Paperwork became the new enemy. Reports about damage, supply transfers, redeployments. Ethan signed them all with the detachment of a man processing his own obituary. He rarely spoke. The soldiers under him avoided his eyes the way you avoid mirrors that tell the truth. Each night, when the lights went out, he imagined Clara and the child he had never met. He pictured a house, maybe near the coast, where laughter sounded like something that could heal. Then he would wake before dawn, heart pounding, and realize it was not a dream, but a confession. He wrote to her once more, though he did not know where she was. The letter was brief. "The war is over. I hope you are safe. I hope you forgive what can't be fixed." He signed it without rank. Whether it reached her or not, he would never know. Months passed. Reeves's name appeared in the newspapers, attached to words like heroism, strategy, diplomatic service. He was appointed to a senior advisory role in the transitional government. Ethan tried to feel hatred, but the emotion had dulled like an old blade. He told himself that men like Reeves always win because they never fight the same war as everyone else. One evening, as the base prepared for full decommission, an intelligence officer arrived with a sealed envelope. "Personal correspondence," he said. Ethan opened it. Inside was a letter written in Clara's hand, dated nearly a year earlier. The ink had faded. The paper smelled faintly of salt. "I'm home now," it read. "The child is healthy. I call him David. He has your eyes, though I pray he never learns your silence. If you ever come back, Don't look for us. Just live in a way that makes the rain gentler. There was no return address, only the word coastal scrawled at the bottom corner. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his breast pocket, over the place where his medals usually hung. That night he didn't drink. He sat under the weak bulb in his office, reading the letter again and again until the words felt memorized into his pulse. He wanted to believe she was safe, that the boy was real, that something of him still existed outside the ruins. He thought of Reeves and the night of the party, and for the first time the memory didn't burn. It simply ached, dull and endless, like weather in the bones. When the base closed, Ethan took the lighter with him. Everything else he left behind. The city received him like a stranger who owed it money, streets clean enough to be cruel, faces too well fed to understand what war does to hunger. He was given an office, a uniform for ceremonies, a pension he never touched. The world had moved on. It had to. He watched parades from windows and tried to recognize the flag. It seemed smaller than he remembered. Reeves called on him once. The man looked older but polished, every gray hair deliberate, every smile rehearsed. They met in a restaurant built to look expensive rather than warm. Reeves spoke easily about politics, about Reconstruction, about the cost of peace. Ethan listened, the way a condemned man listens to the priest. When Reeves raised his glass and said, "To the future," Ethan almost laughed. The future had already happened. It was just waiting for them to admit it. After dinner, Reeves placed an envelope on the table. "For you," he said. "Something from the archives. Thought you might want it." Ethan didn't open it until he got home. Inside was a photograph, a group of officers standing before the command tent. Reeves in the center, smiling. Clara visible in the background, half-turned, holding a clipboard, unaware she was being captured. The photo was dated 2 weeks before the night of the party. Behind the image, Reeves had written a single line in elegant script. "We all did what we had to." Ethan tore the photo in half and fed it to the flame. He lived quietly after that. Years unfolded without permission. He bought a small house near the northern marshes, where fog moved like memory, and no one asked questions. The mornings were long, the nights were longer. Sometimes children from the village came to sell newspapers. He always bought one, though he never read beyond the first page. The sound of rain on the tin roof became his only reliable companion. Meanwhile, in a coastal town 200 miles away, David grew into a young man who believed in order. Clara taught him to be kind but not blind. She never spoke of the war. The boy found the lighter once, buried in a drawer, its brass worn smooth. She told him it was from someone who had once been brave, that was all. When he enlisted, she didn't stop him. She only said, "Promise me you'll come back different from those who left." He promised, as all sons do, without knowing what the promise costs. Clara's health began to fail before she reached 40. The doctor said it was the lungs. She knew it was memory. The body keeps score, even when the mind pretends to forget. She spent her last years in a small hospital overlooking the sea, the same one where she had once worked. Nurses whispered about her quiet dignity, about the way she watched the horizon as if expecting someone. They never guessed how close they were to the truth. David visited whenever his leave allowed. He spoke of training, of discipline, of commanding officers who seemed larger than life. She smiled each time he said General Cole, unaware that the man her son admired was the ghost she had spent 2 decades trying to bury. Life has a cruel sense of symmetry. When she passed, the nurse found a sealed letter on her bedside table, addressed to David Cole, to be given when the time is right. The envelope was heavy, the handwriting precise despite her weakening hand. It would travel through military channels for months before reaching its destination. Ethan received notice of a veterans conference in the capital. He refused the invitation twice, but they insisted. Attendance was a matter of honor. He arrived wearing the same uniform he'd worn on the day of surrender, the fabric too tight around the shoulders. Reeves was there, of course, silver hair, medals, charm. They shook hands for the cameras. "Good to see you, General," Reeves said, his voice polished to a shine. "Still keeping the world in line?" Ethan smiled thinly. "Trying to, though the world keeps slipping out of rank." Reeves laughed, pleased with the performance. The flashbulbs caught them mid-laughter, freezing a lie in perfect clarity. Later, alone in the hotel room, Ethan stared at the city lights. They looked like tracer fire seen from far away, beautiful only because they killed at a distance. He thought of Clara again, the letter, the boy. He wondered if forgiveness was something that could survive ignorance. Somewhere below, a siren wailed, not for war but for ordinary life continuing. He turned off the light and sat in darkness until the city forgot him. It was spring when the envelope arrived. Official seal, forwarding orders, nothing unusual until he saw the sender's name. Veteran Hospital, Coastal Division. Inside was a note from the attending nurse, and beneath it, a letter in Clara's hand. The first sentence stopped his breath. "If this reaches you, then time has been kinder than I expected." She wrote of years spent chasing silence, of a boy who looked like him, of rain that still fell even when she tried to move inland. She told him she was dying, and that the truth had become too heavy to die with her. "His name is David. He carries your face. I've told him only the good parts. Forgive the rest." He read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Outside, the marsh was quiet except for the soft percussion of rain. He felt old, not in years, but in layers, like sediment, remembering each flood. He stood there until the letter in his pocket grew warm from his skin. Then he went inside, lit the lighter, and watched the small flame hold its ground against the dark. That night he dreamed of a road through fog, a child running ahead, laughter echoing in a language he barely remembered. When he woke, the dream stayed. For the first time in decades, he knew what he had to do. He would go back to the capital, to the academy where new officers trained, to the place where his name might still mean something. Somewhere among them was a young man named David Reeves, and Ethan, though uncertain of everything else, knew the sound his own footsteps would make when he finally faced the past. The capital smelled of rain and smoke, as all cities do after they have outlived a war. Ethan Cole arrived quietly, a gray figure among parades of uniforms that had forgotten why they were worn. His name still carried weight in certain corridors. Doors opened, clerks stood straighter, but none of it felt like power. He was there because guilt had finally chosen a direction. Somewhere inside the academy that trained the new officers of the Republic, a young man carried his eyes. David Reeves was 21, an age that mistakes endurance for invincibility. He had been raised in order, fed on discipline, baptized by stories of men like Ethan. The boy's mother had called him her salvation. The Army called him a model cadet. To Ethan, when he first saw him standing at attention in the courtyard, he looked like memory reborn. The resemblance was cruel. The same jawline, the same way the shoulders squared before uncertainty. Even the silence between breaths felt inherited. Ethan watched from the edge of the drill field as David barked commands to a line of recruits. The young man's voice carried with a confidence that made older men remember their own beginnings. When the exercise ended, Ethan stepped forward. "Cadet Reeves," he said. The boy turned, saluted. The name hung between them, familiar and foreign at once. "General Cole," David replied. The tone was respectful but easy, without the stiffness that rank usually demands. Ethan nodded. "You've read the reports," he said. "Numbers, logistics, troop placement. They'll teach you how wars are fought on paper. I'm here to teach you the things that never make it to the page." That was how it began, a mentorship built on coincidence and invisible blood. Each day they met in the old strategy hall, a building whose windows still bore the faint scratches of past bombardment. Ethan spoke little. When he did, his words came slowly, as if testing the air for judgment. David listened, taking notes, asking questions that revealed more heart than calculation. He reminded Ethan of himself before fear became furniture. They walked the grounds together after lectures. The academy overlooked the river, wide and slow-moving, a perfect metaphor for history pretending to heal. Ethan told the boy stories, not the official ones polished for ceremony, but fragments of the truth, softened enough to be bearable. David listened with the hunger of someone who still believed courage was a steady light rather than a candle trembling in wind. One afternoon, while they stood beneath a canopy of trees turning gold, David said, "They say the war ended because men like you knew when to stop fighting." Ethan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No, it ended because we ran out of names to write on the stones." The boy nodded, not understanding, and that innocence, so pure, so intact, cut deeper than blame. Days turned into weeks. Their bond grew into something neither could define. The academy staff called it mentorship. The younger cadets whispered about favoritism. But between them there was only a strange gravity, the pull of unfinished history seeking resolution. Ethan found himself watching the boy the way one watches a flame, afraid it might go out, afraid it might spread. He began to dream again, something he had avoided for years. In one dream, he stood on the ridge where the explosion had torn the earth open. This time, he was not alone. David stood beside him, untouched by mud or fear. "Why didn't you stop it?" the boy asked. Ethan woke with the taste of clay in his mouth and a wordless answer on his tongue. Reeves, now Minister of Defense, noticed their connection. The colonel-turned-politician thrived on appearances, and the sight of the legendary general mentoring a rising star served his narrative well. He invited them both to an official banquet, smiling like a man who had forgotten how to mean it. "It's good for morale," he said, "seeing generations stand together." Ethan agreed because refusal would have raised questions, but inside he felt the old tremor, the sense of a trap, long laid, finally springing shut. The banquet hall was bright in the way only government buildings can be. Sterile light, polished marble, the echo of laughter trained to stop at the correct decibel. David wore his new uniform. He looked immaculate, terrifyingly young. Reeves raised a glass. "To honor," he said. Ethan drank, though the taste was dust. Across the table, David was speaking to an officer's daughter, his face animated, his eyes alive. Ethan felt pride and grief intertwine until he couldn't tell them apart. Later, Reeves approached him near the terrace. "He's a fine boy," he said. "Reminds me of you before the war turned you inside out." Ethan stared at him, unsure whether it was meant as compliment or provocation. Reeves went on, voice low. "His mother would be proud." The words struck like a match in a room full of fumes. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You knew?" Reeves smiled without warmth. "I know many things. Don't look so haunted, old friend. The past only hurts if you keep feeding it." Ethan left without responding. The night air felt colder than the war had ever been. For the first time in years, his hand shook, not from age, but from rage withheld. Reeves's words confirmed what he had suspected, but never dared to name. The man had known everything. Perhaps he had always known. Power and knowledge are twins born from the same ambition. The next morning, Ethan found David at the range. The boy was practicing alone, his aim steady, his breathing controlled. "You shoot like a man with nothing to prove," Ethan said. David smiled. "You taught me that." They stood side by side, the sound of gunfire rolling back from the hills like thunder remembering its duty. When the session ended, David handed him the pistol. "Try," he said. Ethan hesitated, then raised it. His vision blurred slightly, but the muscle memory remained. The shot hit center. The boy laughed, delighted. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to laugh too. It was the sound of something human trying to find its way home. As days passed, Ethan's affection deepened into fear. He could not tell David the truth. The words would break more than silence. But each gesture, each glance, each careless moment of joy felt like a promise he didn't deserve to keep. He began writing letters he would never send, pages addressed to both Clara and the boy. "I see him every day. He stands where I fell. He carries what I threw away. The letters filled a drawer. He burned none of them this time. He wanted the guilt to have form, to breathe. Reeves called him to his office weeks later. The meeting was perfunctory, the pleasantries practiced. "We're expanding the officer training program," Reeves said. "Young Reeves will be one of our shining examples. You'll recommend him, of course." Ethan stared at him. "He doesn't need my recommendation." Reeves leaned back, eyes gleaming. "Still, it means more coming from you. People love a story of fathers and sons, even if the titles are only metaphorical." The implication was acid. Ethan said nothing. Reeves continued, almost kindly. "You've done your penance, Cole. Stop looking backward. The war is finished." Ethan stood. "You keep saying that," he replied. "Maybe one day you'll believe it." He left before Reeves could answer. That evening, he walked the riverbank where the academy grounds ended. The water was dark, moving with slow authority. He thought of Clara's last letter, of her request that he live in a way that made the rain gentler. He wondered if this counted. Somewhere behind him, the academy bell rang for curfew. In the sound he heard something almost like forgiveness, or maybe just distance. David found him there a few minutes later. "I've been looking for you," he said. "The minister asked about my posting. I might be assigned to the Northern Command." Ethan nodded, staring at the water. "You'll do well." The boy hesitated. "You sound as if you won't see me again." Ethan turned, forcing a smile. "The world is small. We'll meet somewhere down the road." They stood together in silence, 2 generations of the same unfinished story. The wind carried the scent of rain. David spoke again, softer this time. "You ever wish things had gone differently?" Ethan answered before he could stop himself. "Every day." The boy nodded as if he understood, though he couldn't. They shook hands, a gesture too formal for what it meant. Then David left, walking toward the dormitory lights. Ethan watched until the figure disappeared, until the rain began. That night, in his quarters, Ethan opened his drawer of unsent letters. He took out one, unfolded it, and read the lines aloud to no one. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the wound. It just teaches it how to live quietly." He placed the page beside the lighter, struck a flame, and let it burn. The smell of paper and smoke filled the room, familiar, almost comforting. He didn't sleep. Outside, the storm gathered again, promising change. Somewhere beyond the city, the road to the north waited, and with it, the inevitable confrontation, the moment when truth would step out from shadow and demand to be named. The next morning came dressed in fog. The city still slept under its gray sheet, while the river whispered the same old arguments against memory. Ethan woke before dawn and sat by the window, uniform half-buttoned, listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock. Each second sounded like a footstep drawing closer to something he could no longer postpone. Orders arrived at midday. David had been confirmed for transfer to the Northern Command, exactly as Reeves had promised. The academy buzzed with excitement, promotion ceremonies, farewell banquets, the machinery of pride turning smoothly. Ethan watched from the margins, silent. Every handshake, every congratulation felt like a rehearsal for loss. That evening, Reeves summoned him again. The letter was written in that careful hand that never betrayed emotion. A private conversation before the boy departs old times' sake. Ethan hesitated before accepting. Some debts, he thought, can only be paid face to face. The minister's office overlooked the government square, its windows tall enough to pretend transparency. Reeves waited beside a decanter of amber liquid, the smile already in place. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to climb stairs," he said. Ethan ignored the humor. "You wanted to see me." "Yes. One last time, perhaps. We've carried the same ghosts long enough. Let's bury them properly." Reeves poured 2 glasses, slid one across. "To the past," he said. Ethan didn't drink. Reeves studied him with amusement. "You never did learn to enjoy survival. That's why I liked you. Men like you keep the rest of us believable." "You used me," Ethan said quietly. Reeves shrugged. I used everyone. That's what command means. You of all people should know." He walked to the window, looking out over the square where cadets drilled in neat formations. "Do you know what keeps a nation alive after war? Stories. Not truth. Truth is corrosive, but stories that make the killing look purposeful. You and we're part of that narrative now." Ethan stepped closer. And Clara? Was she part of the story too? For a moment, Reeves's reflection in the glass stiffened. Then the old smile returned. She was collateral compassion. I admired her spirit. She deserved better than either of us. Ethan's voice stayed calm, though his pulse hammered in his throat. "You destroyed her." Reeves turned. "She survived. You both did. That's more than most can say." Silence settled between them, heavy as the air before a storm. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out Clara's final letter. "She forgave me," he said. "She didn't mention you." The minister's expression flickered, pride, then something brittle beneath it. "Forgiveness," he murmured. "How quaint." Ethan laid the letter on the desk. "The boy is mine." Reeves met his gaze, the faintest crack opening in the armor of certainty. "Does it matter?" "It matters to him." "And what will you do? Tell him the truth? Take away the myth his mother built, the one that kept him whole? You'd ruin him to soothe yourself." Reeves's tone sharpened, years of authority coiling into each word. "Let the boy keep his illusion. Let him believe the world still rewards decency." Ethan shook his head. "You don't get to decide what decency is." Reeves's voice dropped to a whisper. "I decided it the moment you handed her over." The words hit like gunfire at close range. Ethan felt them in his bones. The room shrank until only the two of them existed, two survivors bound by the same rot he wanted to strike him, to break the calm facade, but anger would only feed the man's satisfaction. Instead, he straightened his coat and said, "You've mistaken endurance for victory. That's the last story you'll ever tell me." Then he turned and left. Outside, the square pulsed with evening light. Bells rang from the Academy Chapel, a sound too pure for what followed. He walked without direction until the city thinned into open road. The rain returned, first as mist, then as steady confession. Each drop carried the weight of a word unsaid. The next day, David found him packing. "You're leaving?" the boy asked. "For a while," Ethan replied. "There's a place I need to visit." "The minister said you were offered a seat on the council." Ethan smiled faintly. "He offered. I declined." "Why?" "Because I've spent enough of my life obeying men who mistake ambition for meaning." David frowned, uncertain whether it was rebellion or wisdom he was hearing. "I wish I could stay longer," he said. "There's still so much to learn." "You already know what matters," Ethan told him. "The rest will come when you start asking the right questions." They walked together to the gate. The convoy was waiting, engines idling in polite impatience. The sky had cleared but smelled of more rain. Before the boy climbed into the truck, he turned. "General, my mother once said courage isn't loud, that it's the quiet decision to keep going. She said you taught her that." Ethan froze. The words landed with the gentle cruelty of revelation. "She said that?" "Yes, before she died." He nodded slowly. "She was right." The boy extended his hand. Ethan took it, holding longer than formality required. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I will, sir." The truck rolled away, leaving a trail of dust that settled quickly back into silence. Ethan stood until it vanished over the rise. When he finally turned, Reeves was there, watching from the steps of the administration building. The older man's expression was unreadable. For a heartbeat they were back in the jungle, two soldiers separated by a single unforgivable choice. Then Reeves lifted a hand in mock salute and walked inside. Ethan left the city that night. He drove north until the roads narrowed into rural veins, until the air smelled of pine and cold earth. He stopped only when he reached the old airfield where his war had effectively begun. The hangars were empty, ghosts of machinery lingering in the corners. He stepped out into the rain, the same rain that had followed him for half a lifetime, and let it soak through the fabric of his coat. He thought of Clara's face, of the lighter, of David's voice repeating her words. Courage isn't loud. He whispered them back to the rain and felt something shift, not release exactly, but recognition, the moment when a wound stops asking to be healed and simply accepts its place in the body. A figure emerged from the fog behind him. For a moment he thought it was memory playing tricks, but it was Reeves, coat collar raised, hair plastered with rain. "I knew you'd come here," the minister said. "You always return to the scene." Ethan didn't move. "You followed me?" "Curiosity. I wanted to see what redemption looks like." "There's none here." Reeves stepped closer. "Then why are you trembling?" Ethan looked at his own hands. They were steady. "Because I'm not afraid anymore." The distance between them closed. The rain softened to a whisper. Reeves studied him, searching for the weakness he had always known. Finding none, he smiled a last time, a weary human smile stripped of performance. "So, this is what defeat feels like," he said. Ethan reached into his pocket, took out the lighter, and flicked it open. The small flame stood between them, fragile but unwavering. "No," he answered, "this is what truth looks like." Reeves's gaze lingered on the flame. Then he turned and walked away into the fog. The sound of his steps faded until only the rain remained. Ethan closed the lighter, the click echoing like punctuation at the end of a long confession. He stayed there until night bled fully into the field. The clouds broke for a moment, revealing a thin line of moonlight across the wet ground. Somewhere far off, a train horn drifted through the dark, a reminder that the world still moved forward, indifferent and alive. He felt no triumph, no relief, only the stillness that comes when the last excuse finally dies. When he returned to the city 2 days later, Reeves had resigned. The papers spoke of illness, of exhaustion, of a hero choosing rest. Ethan didn't believe a word. Some endings require silence to keep their dignity. He visited the academy once more before leaving for good. David's name had already appeared on the roster of field officers bound for overseas deployment. Pride and dread twisted together in his chest. In the empty corridor outside the strategy hall, he pinned a note to the bulletin board. It read, "For Cadet David Reeves. When the rain begins, remember that courage can be quiet. E.C." He left without waiting to see if it would be found. That night, as he drove away from the Capitol, the first drops touched the windshield. He rolled down the window and let the air in. Cold and clean behind him, lightning stitched the horizon, illuminating the outline of a city still trying to believe in its own peace. He whispered a name, hers, the boy's, his own, and for once they sounded like a single prayer. Then he kept driving, into rain that no longer felt like punishment. The years that followed moved like a slow tide, erasing sharp edges but never the shape of the shore. Ethan Cole withdrew from the noise of the Capitol and settled in a small house near the marshlands, where fog rose each dawn like breath from the earth. The place was quiet enough for his ghosts to speak freely, and sometimes, when the wind carried the scent of wet grass and distant rain, he could almost convince himself that the world had begun again. He kept few possessions: the lighter, a stack of letters bound by a rubber band, and the uniform folded inside a cedar trunk he never opened. Most days he walked the narrow road leading to the river, where old fishermen mended nets and spoke in short, forgiving sentences. They treated him with the polite respect villagers reserve for strangers who seem both broken and dignified. When they asked about the war, he said little. It ended, was all he ever offered, and they understood that silence was the rest of the story. Time loosened its grip on him but did not let go. His body stiffened, his hands learned the tremor of age, yet his mind remained too clear. Memory, he discovered, was not a disease, but a discipline. You had to feed it slowly, or it would starve you in return. On rainy afternoons he would sit by the window, watching the reeds bow under the weight of water. Each drop wrote the same sentence across the pane: "You are still here." One morning a letter arrived, forwarded through the military registry, the envelope marked by several different post offices as if it had wandered years to find him. The handwriting was unfamiliar, firm and precise. Inside was a single page. "General Cole," it began, "my name is Captain David Reeves. I am writing from the Northern Front, where I have been stationed for the past 2 years. My mother often spoke of you. She said you once taught her what courage meant. I thought you should know that her words still reach this far. I would be honored to meet you if ever you find yourself near the capital again." Ethan read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and setting it beside the lighter. The words were formal, respectful, but beneath them he felt the warmth of something unguarded. He imagined the boy, no, the man now, standing in some distant reign, unaware that his own bloodline was calling across decades. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt the pull of direction. He traveled slowly, taking trains that wound through fields and valleys, scarred by old battles now overgrown with grass. The countryside was quieter than he remembered, though silence could be deceptive. At each station he saw faces young enough to believe in clean endings, and he envied them their ignorance. He arrived at the capital after sunset, stepping out into a city that had learned to hide its pain behind electric lights. David was waiting in the officers' quarters, standing by the window with a file tucked under his arm. When he turned, the resemblance was undeniable. Eyes that questioned rather than judged, a mouth shaped for restraint. They saluted, but the gesture felt unnecessary. "Captain Reeves," Ethan said, "it's been a long road to meet you." "Yes, sir," the younger man replied. "My mother spoke of you often. She said you helped her once when everything else was falling apart." Ethan nodded, unable to trust his voice. "She helped me more than she ever knew." They sat together, talking about the army, about duty, about the price of quiet obedience. David's tone carried both curiosity and fatigue. "Sometimes I wonder if we've learned anything from all this," he said. "Every generation promises not to repeat the last, yet somehow we find new ways to break the same hearts." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's the only history worth teaching." Over the next few days they spent hours walking the city, visiting monuments that celebrated the dead with too much stone and too little truth. Ethan watched the way David carried himself, steady, compassionate, but not naive. He saw in him a version of courage that didn't need war to prove itself. At night they sat in a small cafe near the river, talking until the lights dimmed. Each conversation felt like reclaiming a fragment of something long lost. On the 4th evening, David invited him to the officers' quarters for dinner. The table was modest, the food simple. "I've wanted to ask you something," the younger man said. "Did you know my mother well?" Ethan looked at the candle between them, its flame trembling slightly in the draught. "Yes," he said at last, "I knew her very well." "She said you were kind," David continued, "that you carried too much weight for one man. I think she admired you." He hesitated. "She never spoke about my father, only that he was a soldier who didn't return. Sometimes I think she meant more than that, but I never pressed her." Ethan felt his throat tighten. There it was, the unspoken truth circling closer, patient as a predator. He could have confessed then. He could have told the boy everything and watched the world rearrange itself into honesty. But he looked at David's face, calm and open, untouched by the corruption that had defined his own life, and the words died before they reached his mouth. "She was the bravest person I ever met," Ethan said instead. "If she kept silence, it was out of love, not shame." David nodded slowly. "I'd like to think so." After dinner they stepped outside. The night was warm, the air heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet begun. David walked beside him to the gate. "Sir," he said quietly, "I meant what I wrote in the letter. You've been an example to many of us. Whatever mistakes our leaders made, you reminded us what honor should look like." Ethan stopped. "Honor is a word men use when they've run out of explanations," he said, "but I appreciate the thought." They shook hands. David's grip was firm, steady, the same grip Ethan remembered offering another man in another century. When he returned to his room, he sat in the dark for a long time. He took the lighter from his pocket, flicked it once, and watched the small flame dance across the walls. For years that fire had been a reminder of guilt. Tonight it felt like inheritance. The following morning he visited the military archives. The clerk recognized him and led him to the section reserved for personal files. He searched until he found Clara's record, her service number, her transfer papers, the faded signature confirming her release. He traced her name with one finger, whispering it under his breath. Then he found David's enlistment record, clean and recent, the handwriting steady next to next of kin. The boy had written, "Mother, Clara Reeves, deceased." The space for father was blank. Ethan stood there for a long time. When he finally left the building, the sky had darkened. He walked until the first drops began to fall, slow and deliberate, as if testing his patience. He stopped under a tree, opened his palm, and let the rain fill it. It was cold, but familiar, the same rain that had fallen on every version of his life. He thought of Clara's final words, "Live in a way that makes the rain gentler," and wondered if this counted. That night he dreamed again of the ridge, but this time there were no explosions, no smoke. The field was quiet, the ground healed over. Clara stood beside him, looking toward a horizon that had forgiven itself. "You did enough," she said. When he turned to answer, she was gone, and in her place stood David, smiling the same uncertain smile. Ethan woke with tears on his face, the kind that leave no pain behind. Outside, the first light of morning slid across the window, soft and indifferent. He rose slowly, dressed, and packed his bag. It was time to go back to the marshlands, to the quiet house where his ghosts were waiting. But this time they would have company. He wrote a note to David before leaving. "There are truths that take a lifetime to find. When you do, treat them gently. They are older than either of us. E.C." He left it on the desk, beside the lighter. Ethan left the capital before sunrise. The city's lights still glimmered faintly behind him, but the road ahead was already brightening with a softer, cleaner kind of light. The train moved north through open fields where the earth had started to heal. Grass covered the scars of trenches, and in some places wildflowers grew where shells once fell. The landscape seemed to breathe again, though quietly, as if not to disturb the bones beneath it. Ethan watched it roll past the window and felt the weight of years ease slightly, like a bandage finally loosened. When he arrived at the marshlands, the air was cool and damp, the reeds swaying in their slow ritual. The house waited just as he had left it, simple, silent, faithful in its solitude. He opened the shutters to let in the afternoon light and stood for a while, breathing the old air of the place. It smelled of wood, dust, and the faint trace of smoke from fires long extinguished. He thought of Clara, of her handwriting on the last letter, and whispered her name, not as a prayer, but as gratitude. Days slipped into rhythm. He rose early, walked the narrow path to the river, and sat on the same rock each morning to watch mist rise off the water. He found comfort in the repetition. Routine, he realized, was not the enemy of meaning, but its quiet servant. He read books he'd never finished, wrote letters he never mailed, and learned to live in the company of small noises, the creak of the floorboards, the wind against the shutters, the distant cry of birds returning from somewhere warmer. Weeks later, a courier brought a letter bearing the seal of the ministry. Inside was an invitation, David's promotion ceremony. Ethan hesitated. He had spent years fleeing such rooms, avoiding applause that sounded like forgiveness. But this time, the hesitation faded into something steadier. Responsibility Clara would have gone, he thought. So he went. The ceremony was held in the great hall of the academy, the same hall where he had once stood as mentor, and before that as a younger man dreaming of glory. Now the banners seemed heavier, the light dimmer, the faces younger. David stood on stage, receiving his commission. His voice when he swore the oath was calm, deliberate, carrying both pride and restraint. When the ceremony ended, applause rose like a tide. Ethan waited until it ebbed, then stepped forward. David saw him immediately. "You came," he said, surprise softening into warmth. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Ethan admitted, "but I thought someone should be here to see what's still good in this world." They walked out to the courtyard together. The air smelled of rain again, though the clouds had not yet opened. "You taught me more than you realize," David said quietly, "not just about command, but about the weight behind it." Ethan looked at him. "I only taught you what I learned too late." The younger man studied him for a moment, sensing the gravity beneath the words. "There's something about you I never understood," he said. "You look at people as if you already know their ending." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe I just see how fragile beginnings are." They stood in silence for a long moment. Around them, other officers laughed and posed for photographs, the sound bright and distant. David broke the quiet first. "I found your note," he said, "the one you left on my desk, about truth." Ethan waited. "You wrote that truth is older than us. I think I know what you meant. My mother once said something similar before she passed. She told me that when the rain comes, it carries every story we tried to bury." He looked toward the horizon, where the first drops began to fall. "I think she meant forgiveness." Ethan's voice was almost a whisper. She was right. Rain fell, gentle at first, then steady. Officers scattered toward shelter, but the two men remained, standing beneath the open sky. The rain darkened their uniforms, softened their faces, and erased the thin line between generations. Ethan reached into his pocket and produced the lighter, its brass dull with age. He held it out. "It was hers once," he said. "She gave it to me, and now I think it belongs to you." David took it carefully, his fingers brushing against Ethan's. "I don't smoke," he said, half smiling. "You don't have to," Ethan replied. "Just keep it. It knows what it's for." The younger man nodded. "Thank you. For everything." They shook hands, firm, certain, and for the first time Ethan felt the weight of the past shift into something lighter. The boy's touch was steady, unburdened, the gesture of someone ready to live rather than remember. It was enough. That evening, Ethan returned to the marshlands. The rain followed him home, as it always did, though it no longer sounded mournful. He sat by the window, watching water bead on the glass. The lighter's absence left a small, satisfying emptiness on the table. He realized it wasn't loss he felt, but balance. The story had traveled as far as it needed to go. In the days that followed, his health declined quietly, without drama. Age approached like an old friend finally returning from a long journey. He spent more time resting, less time walking. Sometimes he caught himself speaking aloud to people who were no longer there. Clara, the men from his squad, even Reeves. He found he could do so without bitterness. Forgiveness, he learned, was not a gesture, but an atmosphere, something that settled slowly into the room until breathing it became natural. One afternoon, he heard footsteps outside the door. When he opened it, a young postal officer stood there, soaked to the knees. "Message for you, sir," the man said. The envelope was marked with military insignia. Ethan took it, thanked him, and watched him leave through the rain. Inside, the letter was brief. "Captain David Reeves reports safe return from Northern Command. Requests leave to visit family estate in coastal province," at the bottom in smaller script. "I still have the lighter. The flame works fine." Ethan read it twice and smiled. He placed the letter beside the last photograph he owned of Clara, taken decades earlier, the two of them standing in uniform, smiling at something outside the frame. Then he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and listened to the rain play its slow, patient rhythm against the roof. Night crept in gently. The storm passed, leaving only the faint smell of wet earth and the hum of crickets in the reeds. He felt the ache in his chest deepen, but not painfully, more like a reminder that something inside still lived. He thought of David, of Clara, of the world continuing beyond his reach, and for once he did not envy it. He felt content, a word he had not trusted in years. When the final light of day faded, he whispered into the darkness, "Courage isn't loud." The sound of his own voice surprised him. It was steady, warm. Outside, the marsh reflected the stars, a mirror for everything he could no longer touch. In the early hours of morning, the storm returned, soft, persistent, familiar. Rain tapped against the window, as if repeating an old conversation. When the sun rose, it found the house quiet, the chair by the window empty, and a single letter resting on the table beside an extinguished lamp. It read, "For David, when you come, don't mourn." The rain has finally learned to fall gently. The wind carried the words somewhere beyond the marsh, where water met sky and memory lost its name.